Welcome. As people are coming in, just let people start joining. Great to see everybody. Welcome to this really, I think, in a very exciting moment to hear from Oxford in the UK, have a chance to join with all of you, who I'm sure are from many different parts of the world, joining us for what we've put together as our Earth Month special. So, a really special moment to come together and have a conversation about the new rule, the new role of sustainability strategy, what this set of questions looks like right now in a very contested and uncertain time. And so, really delighted to see you all joining. I am Dr. Mary Johnston-Louis. I'm a senior fellow in management practice here at Saïd Business School, and I have the great honor of collaborating with my colleague Alexis McGivern, who's also here with us. We co-direct, along with Sam Frankhauser, the Oxford Sustainable Business Program. Alexis is program director, of course, of our shared program, but also head of stakeholder engagement at Oxford Net Zero. So delighted to have you with us, Alexis, and also joined by Amir Amelzadeh, my colleague here at the Saïd Business School, and such an important feature of the program in the sense that he's done extensive work on teaching and on research looking at sustainability disclosure and sustainable finance. So he is the academic director of the Oxford Sustainability Program and Reporting ESG Management Program and the ESG and Sustainable Finance Program. So you've got three people here on this call who spend our days and our lives thinking about these issues, and we are so looking forward to having the chance to be in conversation with you. So if I can just invite you to please use the chat. Let's go ahead and test it out now, if you don't mind. Go ahead and please say who you are and very importantly, where in the world you're dialing in from. That's something that we absolutely love to see. And one of the things that we're most proud of here at Oxford Saïd Business School and across the university, of course, including Oxford Net Zero and the Smith School, is the global nature of our conversations. And so please do pop into the chat where you are joining us from today in the world. Just to give you a sense of how this time will be structured, I'll be sharing a bit up front, passing over to Amir, passing then over to Alexis. And what we'd encourage you to do is, as we go, please use the chat. Ask questions that are coming up in real time. No need to filter. This is meant to be, as much as possible, something like a virtual classroom. And so please do use the chat to put questions in that are coming to you live as the speakers are speaking. And what Alexis will do is she will actually triage these and she'll contact you by DM on the chat, so direct message on the chat, to tee up your questions for the end of our session together. So go ahead, get them in the chat, and we're looking forward to, midway through this session, a really full conversation among everyone who's here participating. So thank you. Next slide, please, Dawn. Great to see people coming in. Staffordshire, Abidjan. Love this. I love the level of global connection that we have in these conversations. Fantastic. Everyone from Milton Keynes in England to South Africa. Fantastic. So I've mentioned that each of us who are on this call, we do spend a lot of time thinking about how we communicate these ideas and how we engage with practitioners on the questions of sustainability. And so this is just a snapshot. My colleague Tennille Ballard will be joining us at the end of this call to walk you through this in a bit more detail, but we have multiple opportunities to go beyond this webinar, whether that's online, through the multiple programs that each of the three of us lead, and also in person. And so we want to just make you aware of that, make you warmly invited, and also acknowledge that we know these webinars always go way too quickly, and you hopefully we would anticipate will be left wanting more. So please do reach out with questions about these wonderful programs, of which we're really proud. So thank you. Let's dive in. I wanted to kick us off, if that's okay, just on the next slide, please, with something I'm doing in almost every conversation I start here at Oxford currently, in the kind of climate and context in which we find ourselves. I'm inviting participants, students in my class, executives who come and learn and work with us, just to spend some time as we get into the topic reflecting on what is an assumption or a belief that you held about sustainability 5 years ago, could be as recently as 2 years ago, that you feel no longer holds in light of your experience. We're living through a time of significant global shifts, everything from AI to political shifts to really serious challenges in terms of geopolitical risks. And I just want to be able to hear from you. How is that shifting, if at all, the way that you think about sustainability and strategy? And so, again, use the chat. It's there for us to have this conversation. So I invite you to please, I'm loving this. So this is great. Sustainability is not an add-on. It is a way to achieve better results. Great example. So sometimes this is a really great way to get it for us as well, as presenters, to get a sense of what's in the room. So if you're able to put into the chat one assumption or belief you held that no longer holds, we'd love to use that as part of our Q&A and our kind of broader discussion as we temper our remarks as we go along. Next slide, please. I want to offer you also, because when we come to Oxford, we actually have the opportunity in person to bring you across the history of the university here. And that's something that we can't always do in this virtual environment, but I want to offer you a little bit of history and a little bit of language as you go into this webinar, because I've found it to be a really important point that helps us to think about the real shifts that are happening in terms of sustainability and strategy today. So this will be very brief. I just want to bring your attention to language. I realize we have multiple languages represented on the call, so this may look different depending on what your working language or home language might be. But in the case of English, there's a word that comes up again and again when it comes to sustainability, which is managing trade-offs. So at the corporate level, how do corporations manage investments in the transition, investments in new, apologies, excuse me, thank you. In new products and services, investments in meeting sustainability targets, while at the same time competing in an increasingly precarious and unpredictable market, right? So we often find the language of trade-offs, and I'm finding it very useful in these conversations on strategy, just to remind all of us that this word trade-off is actually quite new. And it comes from my home country. It comes from the early 20th century in American, US English. And it denotes necessarily a compromise between two mutually exclusive outcomes, right? And so this is the interesting, is this idea that we cannot pursue both. Whereas if you move to the next slide, I want to offer you, in the spirit of Oxford language, another much older way of seeing and another much older word, which is paradox. And that one's on the next slide, Duong. So paradox actually comes from the 16th century, and it was used primarily in English until the early 20th century to talk about something that at first seems counterintuitive, but actually is well-founded or true. And so if we move to the next slide, I want to just offer you the way that this slight mindset shift and language shift, I think, helps us to come into what Amir and Alexis are going to be talking us through today, which is just on the next slide, please, Duong. Thank you. The ability to really distinguish at the strategy level between what might feel like a trade-off in the moment, and what actually is something that the company needs to pursue in tandem over time. So this is an exercise I do with my students. We won't do it now, but very happy to talk you through that in future. It's the kind of work that we do in our courses. And then in the next slide, what I want you to think about is, how do you begin to untangle trade-offs, right? So when we think about trade-offs, how do we begin to untangle them? We think about shifting time horizons. We think about bringing in new resources, be they financial, human, or new knowledge, and we think about partnerships. And so I'll just, on my final slide before I pass over to you, Amir, I'll just walk you through a little bit of how I've been seeing the individuals and leaders with whom I work really bring this kind of idea of a trade-off or a paradox rather than a trade-off mindset into their daily work. Next slide, Duong, please. Thank you. So, a case where many of you will be. You are advising a senior leader, a CEO, reporting to your board. Margins are under pressure everywhere. Supply chain risk is up. Competitors' moves are unclear. A trade-off mindset asks, where can we cut? What has to be moved? What has to be moved out? What do we need to say no to? Which is key for strategy. But a paradox mindset encourages us to ask, under what conditions can both objectives be evolving together? And so then the question is, do we slow our investment, or how can we frame our answer thinking about where we can get other resources, other partnerships, or shifting time horizons? So this is a deep dive. I do actually a whole day class on this, on the kind of framing from trade-off to paradox mindset, but I hope it's useful as I pass over to you, Amir, because the context in which we sit is complex, and it requires us to be able to think in this much more both and kind of paradox manner. So over to you, Amir, please. I hope that's useful for everyone. And please keep, I'm going to catch up in the chat. Please keep saying what your beliefs have shifted. I'd love to see more. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks for kicking us off and for the introduction. I can see a lot of comments coming in the chat as well, and very Very interesting. We'll pick up some of those as we go along. As Mary said, my name is Amir Amelzadeh. I'm Associate Professor of Accounting at Saïd Business School. And what I really want to talk about in the next 5 to 10 minutes, we really want to have this interactive discussion with you. So just provide some ideas of the research that I've done in this area and what I see talking to organizations and investors in particular as well. Is really thinking about kind of three pillars. If you think about where we are in sustainable business, and there's been a dramatic shift over the past couple of years, and the comments in the chat actually also reflect that to some extent. And we really kind of, in my view, really move, and as the first pillar here, we're really moving from disclosure, really focusing on disclosure, which is now being essentially implemented through the ISSB's IFRS 1, S1, and S2, and obviously in the EU, the CSRD, to kind of using sustainability information that has been disclosed also now for internal decision making, really for essentially CapEx decisions. And if you think about where organizations sit, and if you look at these three pillars on the slide, it's really kind of a sequence of where organizations are progressing towards. So most organizations, I think, are still in pillar one, where essentially it's on the disclosure side, where now there's lots of discussions around, okay, how do we actually use that information also internally for decision making, not only for compliance with reporting requirements. Really, the crux is in pillar three, right? This is really where you want to be, is integrating sustainability into financial strategy, integrating it really into how you make CapEx decisions, how you embed metrics into management accounts for those decisions, and of course, as you're creating kind of a central hub, finance that integrates sustainability into all of strategic decision making, and even though externally there's a sequence, so we're moving essentially towards pillar three. Internally, from an organization's perspective, you need to think about this as a simultaneous kind of task, because it's not really, you can't really start with compliance, which is what most organizations are starting, without thinking about strategy. So that order is actually backwards. So thinking about strategy first and how to embed sustainability into your strategy and business model, and then compliance and disclosures come from that, because that's what investors want to know, and that's what regulators are also now starting to know. And then there's an external factor that this is pillar two, is essentially the rise of accountability, meaning that now it's not only a reputational risk for companies to disclose sustainability information that might in ex post not bear out or be true to or be exaggerated. Now, essentially, the regulations are making directors responsible, and there's greenwashing regulations, but also in the disclosure regulations in CSRD and in UK and in the UK as well through ESMA, there's more focus on essentially greenwashing and how to hold directors responsible for it. Next slide, please. So let me walk you through each of these individually, each of the three pillars individually. As mentioned, I think where most companies are is essentially in the thinking about disclosure. Okay, this is something we now have to do. There's the CSRD if you're in Europe. There's the ISSB that has come out, which essentially gets adopted or is essentially being adopted in 20 jurisdictions so far, and probably more to come. The first one in Turkey has already implemented ISSB disclosure, sustainability disclosure since this year. So there's the first reports are out. In another project with colleagues at Oxford, we have analyzed those and to see kind of what the impact is. Go back, please. Oh, and really, of course, many organizations are also running their materiality assessments. So this is where most organizations are, but really where you want to be is strategic decision making, and that means that not thinking about materiality assessments only as an exercise to decide what to disclose externally to stakeholders, whether it's financial materiality, the ISSB lens essentially, or whether it's the double materiality to other stakeholders, so the CSRD lens, but it's really using that materiality assessment to also decide what is important internally and what sustainability factors to integrate into decision making, into strategic decisions. And hence, there's various ways to do this. Scenario analysis is the most common one that companies use, where you essentially stress test your CapEx decisions over multiple years against essentially different scenarios, right? Different climate scenarios to assess what would happen. Different climate scenarios, which also then come with different essentially carbon pricing scenarios if you focus on carbon pricing. And we've done some research on essentially materiality and how companies and investors think about it. And there's obviously variation across sectors, what is material to different businesses. But really more importantly, it's actually dependent not only within each sector, there's overlap, of course, but it really depends on your business model. So, which means that every organization has to really focus on their materiality assessment and focus on those particular sustainability issues that are material to their business, which could be different even compared to your competitors in the same sector. Next slide, please. So from moving essentially from disclosure to decision making, one driver of this is also this rise of accountability, I would call it, or this rise of disclosure regulation, which comes with an increase in accountability. So we have, as I mentioned, the ISSB now that has already issued their IFRS S1 and S2, and multiple jurisdictions, including the UK, that essentially is adopting it into their own UK SRS, is adopting ISSB or IFRS S1 and S2. And of course, there's the EU that has the CSRD, which now 7,000 companies are in scope. Used to be 50,000, but with the omnibus amendments, which were essentially some of the relief of most of the large burden on companies, this scope has essentially shrunk quite a bit. But nevertheless, the extent of the disclosure requirements are still the same, and the lens is still the same, the double materiality lens, covering a variety of essentially a variety of information points on the sustainability activities of the business, its impact on the environment, and linked essentially to the European sustainability reporting standards, which are similar to the ISSB's standards, give you essentially a set of guidance of what needs to be disclosed and in what way. But more important, I think there's implications essentially for how you govern your sustainability strategy internally, in terms of this requires essentially internal controls. This requires documenting procedures. It really requires being assurance ready. Because one of the big trends here that I think we'll see, which is to some extent still underappreciated, is this move towards assurance of sustainability information. At the moment, still limited assurance. The reasonable assurance, so the more expansive assurance, has been essentially taken out of the CSRD. It was in there, has been taken out of there from its mandatory requirements in, I think, 2027 or 8 or when it was. But I think still the market trend is towards requiring more and more assurance of the data, which is what investors and other stakeholders want. But it's also important for internal decision making, because you want to have reliable information. And I think another underappreciated point is board literacy, in the sense that given now that directors will be personally accountable for the accuracy of disclosures, which now includes sustainability disclosures, which under CSRD actually integrated into the financial disclosures anyhow, this requires kind of every board member to at least know, or at least have the ability to ask the right questions towards to management, to understand what the disclosures say, what they don't say, and where there are uncertainties, and about the reliability of that information. And there's been in recent years, quite some enforcement actions conducted by various national regulators, so ESMA one, and there's the European directive. The FCA in the UK has had some actions on greenwashing. So this is becoming, for regulators, also becoming a big issue, and hence it's not only a reputational issue for companies, but also now becomes a legal liability. Next slide, please. And the last pillar is essentially what I would call the holy grail, where companies could be aspiring to, which is not an easy task, is essentially bridging the sustainability world, which traditionally sat essentially separate in organizations in the sustainability function and the finance function, essentially the CFO's office, and now building essentially a bridge between those two. And there's various models that you can draw from, and one is a multi-capital model that essentially assesses or says that the entire enterprise value of a business is driven by various capitals, not only financial, but also natural capital, intellectual capital, and social capital. And hence, it requires kind of an integrated thinking and also integrated reporting of these issues that would affect essentially strategic planning, embedding sustainability-related risk into your long-range financial planning. So from essentially thinking about stranded assets, climate risk on those assets, thinking about carbon pricing developments and how those carbon prices might actually change your NPV IRR calculations over a long horizon if essentially those become more binding. But it also could involve resource scarcity, right? And how you model resource scarcity as an input and as cost, and now politically driven, of course, but what is going on at the moment, these kind of risks of resource price spikes are more likely also under essentially changing environments, a changing environment. The second level would be essentially capital allocation, how to think about integrating carbon prices into your CapEx decisions and calculations, and whether essentially if you calculate with an $80 per ton CO2 ton, how attractive essentially your investment is compared to $100, and what the likelihood is that essentially carbon prices rise to $100, and how you would think about this essentially internally. And then lastly, also in terms of performance reporting, that it becomes, the integration here is essentially that it becomes the day-to-day part of management of the business to think about not only the financial outcomes, but also the sustainability outcomes that are linked to the financial outcomes. So we're not talking about essentially management becoming or business become charities, but really thinking about what are the sustainability risks and opportunities that are driving my financial value. Next slide, please. Would I just briefly, and then I stop, just briefly showing you some empirical evidence on what I just essentially said. So one is that sustainability information seems to be driving asset allocations, so capital allocations. So this is from a study from where we look at European retail investors, and the graph, I'll just point to the graph on the right, which shows essentially companies that disclose more sustainable information, that are rated highly on their disclosure, are essentially receiving more investment flows versus those that are essentially on the bottom quantile, the bottom 20%, that are essentially experiencing relative outflows of investments. So there seems to be essentially a correlation with investment flows by investors. Next slide, please. There seems to also be a pricing in capital markets of sustainability attributes. So we looked at another study with the same authors. Actually, we looked at green bonds and how green bonds are potentially improving also the liquidity of the conventional bonds of a company, because with green bonds you have more disclosures. You have essentially a use of proceeds disclosures that enable investors to assess investment projects or businesses better, that improves the information environment and reduces or increases liquidity also for conventional bonds. But we also show, and this is the graph on the right, that essentially bond spreads of green bonds, which is the green line, do not move in line with spreads of conventional bonds during crises. COVID was one, and green bonds have hardly moved compared to the conventional bonds. So there's also some insurance properties, and the question is why that exists. And the investors are different. As long-term investors, they're looking at other attributes. Interestingly, though, green bonds are highly sensitive on greenwashing, essentially risk, which means that if the company has some environmental controversy, green bond prices move much sharper than conventional bond prices. So there's that link as well. And next slide, please. And just to close is how this then and whether this then actually leads to generating enterprise value or financial value. And this is from a study that I've done with Schroders Asset Management, where we looked at impact companies. This is listed equities. They had a methodology to essentially identify impact firms, and we looked at the financial performance of those impact firms. This is a graph, and it's, to my surprise, essentially companies that had sustainability linked to their business model and linked to their strategy, integrated, have actually outperformed in this case, it's the MSCI Equity, which is the global, essentially the index of global stocks, by some margin. And we tried different portfolios of different firms, and then try to kind of find out why this is the case. And it was actually linked to the actual impact that these firms are producing, because that impact is linked to their value creation, to their profit creation. It's inherent in their business model. So that's essentially those firms that are very good at integrating sustainability into the business model, into their value creation, are those that are benefiting most from it, also financially. I'll stop right here and hand over to Alexis. Happy to discuss any questions as they come up.
Great. Thanks so much, Amir. And yes, my hand is kind of cramping from how quickly I was taking notes from all the amazing insights from your research. So thanks so much for sharing, and thanks, Mary, for kicking it off with this idea of trade-offs and paradoxes. If we can flick to the next slide, please. So my work is kind of very tied to what Amir is doing in terms of how you're basically taking things like disclosure tools and using that to inform decision making. But actually that forms just one part of the wider spectrum of how we take net zero as this high level scientific target that has a very long-term goal, 2050, as embedded in most kind of climate models. How we take that global goal and translate it into organizational pathways. Specifically, what we work with is on corporate pathways to net zero. And so what we have done, I've been at Oxford Net Zero for about 4 years. Oxford Net Zero has been in existence for about 5 years. And originally what it was set up to do was really translate this global goal of net zero into something that was measurable and eventually auditable, so that we know one single organization is on track to deliver their contribution towards global net zero. So what we started to do was to break down what it means to set a net zero target, all the way from the foundational pieces around preparing your governance. So Amir, you were speaking about internal carbon pricing, for example. That's some of the foundational governance pieces that allow an organization to both take its climate targets seriously, but also to have things in place like, for example, tying the achievement of climate goals to executive remuneration, for example. So those kind of governance practices help to create the foundations. The next and the sort of most obvious first step is measuring your emissions and setting a baseline. Then setting a target, so making sure that that is appropriate for your organization in terms of what you can achieve, but also what your responsibility is according to your sector or your past emissions, what the appropriate timescale should be. Then we move into the actual decarbonization, implementing your plan, and then finally, along the way and also at the net zero target date, counterbalancing emissions. So any hard to abate, so basically hard to decarbonize emissions, or the new kind of term of the day is ongoing emissions responsibility, which is what we used to call beyond value chain mitigation. So basically things that you are going to counterbalance or pay for that is not necessarily your business's responsibility. So those are kind of sequential as we move through towards 2050. But underpinning both of those are reporting. So this is very much what Amir was speaking about in terms of disclosure of your climate related information to show progress, and also thinking about the beyond climate impacts. So these are unintended impacts on equity, water, health, and also thinking about lobbying and advocacy towards global net zero goals. So just to set the scene, standards give that guidance. And what's been very interesting, if we can go to the next slide, is that several of the major standards that underpin this kind of architecture and this, conveyor belt of consolidation of best practice from voluntary initiatives all the way through to regulation. 3 of them are changing this year. They are being updated and revised. You might feel it's an unfortunate trick that 3 of the major standards are all being done in the same year because it creates a lot of work for people like me. But actually, it's very, very intentional to make sure that these are as useful and interlocking with one another as possible. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which many will be familiar with, it's the most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard in the world. It's being revised. It has been on the process of being revised since 2024, and we expect that we'll have a new draft of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol this year. I am on the technical working group for the corporate standard revision, which has been a very interesting experience, and even as someone who really loves net zero standards, has been a stretch of my capacity to withstand the technical, the technical details of this. But it's really interesting because the Greenhouse Gas Protocol underpins so much of that foundational piece that I mentioned earlier around setting a baseline and measuring your emissions, and also underpins, of course, disclosure. The second is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is the largest validator of corporate climate targets in the world. And basically, companies submit documentation to show their target piece of that series of actions that I showed. They submit their targets and they get validated and as a science-based target. So basically show that they're in compliance with a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. And finally, the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, which interestingly enough, just for a fun fact about standards, ISO is not an acronym, but rather it is the word isos, which means equal in Greek. So ISO is the same in all languages, which is just a fun standards fact. But that it is creating the first ever auditable and verifiable standard for net zero, which basically takes a lot of what has been done in the voluntary landscape, but puts it to the sort of standard and credibility that ISO brings. And this is a very different process to the former 2, and that is that the ISO system is quite like the UN system, where you have national standards bodies. So, for example, we have one in the UK, the British Standards Institution, and there will also be the Canadian Standards Board, etc. Each of them basically send experts into these negotiations, and then the experts come up with a draft text, and then that is voted on afterwards. So this is the kind of most distributed model. And the interesting thing about this year, in terms of standards, is that we're seeing this sort of convergence and verifiability of these standards. And it's also a really interesting time to integrate some of the pieces around the beyond climate or impacts on equity or people that have been traditionally left out of the standards landscape. So if we can go to the next slide, please. One area that I work on in particular is really about this idea of serviced emissions. So this idea that the emissions that are facilitated by lawyers, consultants, advertisers, PR firms, public affairs agencies, that those all should follow a similar trajectory to financed emissions, where banks had to disclose and report the emissions that they were underwriting or financing. So if they were financing a coal power plant, then they would have to kind of report against those emissions. So we see that this idea of service emissions is really starting to shift from the voluntary landscape into the standards landscape. And so what we see is what companies enable, sell, or promote is starting to become as material as what they directly emit. So what has been traditionally captured in the standards, which is around business travel or office energy use, we're really starting to see that shift quite dramatically. And if we can go to the next slide, please. This is just a visualization of basically what we are currently looking at, which is operational emissions, as I say, business travel and office energy use. And we're really starting to widen that, that lens of focus into the type of work that lawyers or consultants do, the clients that they work with, and the advice that they give, and the sort of future scenarios that offers. So just in 2 minutes, I'll just capture how these net zero standards are starting to shift to incorporate some of these new ideas, just to demonstrate how these standards and these reporting tools are not necessarily fixed. They're changing with our new understandings of what good practice looks like. So if I can go to the next slide, please. The greenhouse gas protocol, sorry, this is a very boring slide, but it's a very exciting thing, which, as I say, is undergoing its first major revision in about 20 years. And the exciting development in the greenhouse gas protocol is that of the categories against which companies can report, there is a proposal for a new category for facilitated activities. And these, there's a list of different activities. These are, a lot of them are financial related facilitated activities. But you can see that big, beautiful red arrow is about the advertising sector. So there are two places where advertising and the emissions tied to advertising campaigns are specifically included in the greenhouse gas protocol. This is still an optional category. This will be an optional category, but it just basically shows that these new standards are starting to embed new senses of what is good climate disclosure. If we go to the next slide, please. The Science-Based Targets Initiative. Oh, sorry. This is some work that we did kind of earlier this year about why and how to include service emissions in the updated greenhouse gas protocol. This is a policy brief that we published with some researchers from the Free University of Amsterdam and Stanford, and some colleagues of ours in the civil society space. But this is a very, if you're interested in the nitty-gritty, this is a good one to nerd out on. So it gets into the weeds of the greenhouse gas protocol. But if we could go to the next slide, please. The Science-Based Targets Initiative, as I say, it is going through its update to the corporate net zero standard, and professional services are actually the largest validated sector within SBTI, which is interesting because the asks that they are making to professional services firms has been considerably outside of their major sphere of influence, which is the advice that they offer. And so the latest draft of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the final draft will be coming out in June, but the latest draft that was published in November really showed them taking on this new way of thinking. They named under services that support fossil fuel extraction, processing, distribution, marketing, sales, or expansion, they specifically named services like legal, consulting, PR, and advertising, etc. And before, this was very much constrained to services that supported fossil fuel extraction, was the physical transport services that moved barrels of oil. So we're really starting to see a recognition of how different services can be impactful in this space. And then next slide, please. And then ISO is, the draft is out in a few months' time, but that is really just about integrating this kind of thinking. But the ISO has a lot longer process in which they keep things close to the chest for a lot longer. But just to close, we're doing this kind of work around how we integrate this idea of service emissions in the Service Emissions Hub, which I run at Oxford, and that is really about three pillars of work. The first is about implementation of some best practice by professional services providers. So really getting a coalition of the willing who are willing to integrate some of these ideas. Advocacy for the standards, as you saw in the previous slides. And our third and most recent pillar is about client engagement. So trying to create demand side levers for change there. So if you're interested in that work, we talk about it a lot on the OSBP and the Oxford Sustainable Business Programme, and happy to answer any questions in the Q&A as well. So that's all from me. I know we're going into Q&A now, and I think Mary's going to kick that off.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you, Amir. And what a packed set of conversations here. And so, what I want to do is actually kick off the Q&A. Alexis will be reviewing the questions and contacting you by DM to have the opportunity to queue us up. But I'm going to start with you, Dale, if that's okay, Dale Burridge, because it's really almost a clarification directly for Amir, and I'd love to give Amir the chance to respond. So I'm not sure if we're able to unmute. I think we can't, if that's correct. And so what I'll do is, can we unmute?
I think I can, yeah. Let me just
Okay.
get Dale up.
Dale, if you would like to state your question, you're warmly welcome. And if not, I will take your silence as a decline. But it's a great question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and please use your video if you're so inclined. It's a great way to make us feel like we're a bit more connected. Thanks for going first, Dale, if you
I
wish.
don't know how to do my video on the web browser. There you go.
I think you might not be able to in webinar.
I might not be able to. Okay, yeah, sorry. I found it probably a bit difficult to ask the question, so it seems maybe a bit of a long question there. But I thought the research looked really interesting. That you're creating that link, I think, between the integration of sustainability measures and the performance of those organisations. But I guess I wondered, maybe a bit more from a challenge perspective, how much of that do you think is as a direct consequence of, I guess, exclusively integrating sustainability measures, or could it be, or have you seen, could it be associated with perhaps, I don't know, the attitude, the behaviours of those types of organisations? So could it just be that those types of organisations, those that do integrate sustainability, that's the link, that's the kind of indicator that's more linked with the performance? So I'm trying to work out how, is it as clear cut as that?
Yeah, no, it's not. Thank you, Dale. No, great question. It's always obviously difficult to attribute any financial outperformance, and this is now what I just showed you, just very briefly, was essentially capital market outperformance, so stock returns, controlling for the common drivers would drive essentially stock returns. There's still an outperformance for those firms, right? But the question is, of course, how directly is that linked to the sustainability characteristics, right, or to the impact characteristics of those firms? We try to disentangle that a little bit, but you're right. It's not, you cannot fully causally, right, attribute the sustainability integration or the impact of those firms to essentially that outperformance. It could be other factors, intangible factors that are related essentially to why those firms are integrating sustainability that is essentially driving that outperformance. That's correct. What we did do is we tried to see, because Schroeder's had essentially an impact materiality assessment or score, where they try to see how much of essentially the revenues of the firm are coming from the impact that they're creating, the positive impact or the reduction of negative impact that they are creating. They scored those firms by that, and that measure was actually contributing to that outperformance quite a bit. But there was other measure, like other things that are contributing to the outperformance as well. So long story short, it can be attributed to it, but not exclusively.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll go now to Samson for their question. Samson, are you able to come off mute? Okay, I will read Samson's question in their place. So this, I think, I'm going to put it out to the crowd, but Amir, you might want to take it, and I also have some thoughts, and Mary, I'm sure you do too. Accounting is supposed to be technologically neutral. Why isn't it that Why isn't it the government that mandates the standards rather than the accounting profession proposing the requirements? How does the disclosure of sustainability information align with the cost-benefit constraint in the IFRS conceptual framework? As far as I know, collecting much of this data is very costly, and because it is highly specialized, it is also not easily understood or absorbed by investors.
All correct statements, and also again a very good question. Let me start with the kind of first part, which is who is essentially setting those standards. So if you think about what the aim is, so the aim is to achieve a global international standard because you want to make essentially sustainability information comparable across all companies, irrespective of essentially countries and regions, for international capital to flow to those that are more sustainable, which means you need a supranational standard setting body to achieve it. That standard setting body, the ISSB, has representatives from various regions to essentially bring in those perspectives. That's number one. That doesn't mean that the standards are now set and mandatory, legally mandatory, right? As they are essentially issued by the ISSB. Each country jurisdiction still has to essentially impose those into law, and which is essentially then what happens through the governments, right? So the government mandates. And through that process, there might be small tweaks here and there where governments say, well, we don't want this requirement and we add this requirement. So overall, the ISSB is providing the global baseline, and then individual jurisdictions and governments are adding essentially kind of their flavor to it. Explicitly in the ISSB's remit and in IFRS S1, you have essentially explicitly in there that companies should collect and report this information without essentially so if it's not too costly for them to do so, right? So the ISSB makes it explicit that if it's too costly, then essentially you are exempt from doing it, and you can evidence that it's too costly because for whatever reason, right? Your systems are still not in place and so on. So the ISSB is a relatively large flexibility around what you have to disclose given the cost benefits. So this is a very important concept here, that essentially the benefits outweigh the costs. Difficult to assess, but essentially that's the aim. And yes, the information is very specialized, but again, the aim of these standards is to make them comparable, to make the information comparable and less complex for investors to understand. You still need expert investors, so expert sustainability or ESG experts within investment houses that can analyze that kind of information. But the role of the ISSB is also an IFRS S1 and S2 is to make that explicit in the reports what the financial implications of that information is, right? So you're translating that into the investor's language, which is essentially the financial materiality. A very good question.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm going to try to call on Robert, but if that doesn't work, then I will just read their question. Okay, I'm just going to read it. So, Robert, this is from Robert Wyson for everyone, but I think, Mary, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Reflecting upon the current context, one, how do you anticipate the Middle East conflict to impact the focus on sustainability? For example, the need for resilience, energy security, accelerated energy transition. And two, during economic downturns, is there a rollback retreat from sustainability? For example, a postponement of regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. These are great questions and exactly the kind of context we are referring to when we kicked off the webinar. So I'll take them in reverse order because I think it helps us to understand what we mean when we talk about sustainability. So specifically, let's think about where sustainability has come from in terms of a kind of corporate concept and a way it shows up in strategy. So if we were to roll back several decades, we'd be talking about corporate social responsibility, which, as one of our participants pointed out in one of their reflections earlier on what might have shifted, is this idea that corporate social responsibility was something that could be added on to the core business. And it was not, as Amir's describing, integrated into core decision-making around strategy, capital allocation, new product decisions, business models, etc. So we have moved significantly. And when I say we, I mean the way that we're talking about sustainability in this conversation is something that brings sustainability into the core of how businesses create value. And one of the frames that I find quite helpful is it's something from the new Financial Times guide that my colleague Richard Barker and I put together. He's actually an ISSB board member. And we talk about the idea that, exactly as Amir is saying, companies create value because of their interactions and through their interactions, really with social and environmental systems in all kinds of different ways. So in terms of companies who perhaps might have been pursuing sustainability in a way that might have been in more of the category of comms, of reputation management, of something that was not aligned to the core value creation mandate of the business, those are inevitably vulnerable along with other activities and functions in the business that are perceived to be discretionary in times of crisis. And so I would say it'd be really interesting, Amir, to think about with the set of companies that you looked at in your study, for companies who, now we can do that set of analysis in the next few years. I'm sure you'll be able to see, for the companies for whom sustainability was integrated into their core thesis around value creation, do they abandon those commitments and in times of economic challenge? So I think that'll be a really interesting empirical answer that you'll be able to shine some light on with your data in the next few years, unfortunately, given how we're facing the global climate at the moment. So I would say those that are not adding value are very likely to be cut, right? And I think that's why it's so important for us to think about strategy from a mindset that says, how do we do the both and? How do we bring that paradox mindset? And I think it's nowhere more evident than what we're seeing in the Middle East. And we're seeing a fundamental lifting of the veil and a real bringing to the fore of the way that our global economy does have significant fragilities and dependencies, and is able to be really thrown off course by actually quite a small number of levers and actors. And I think that it's one of those that I often talk about with my students, that actually, were we to design a global economy from the ground up now, if we were to be presented with a business plan that actually meant that we relied on 20-kilometer or sometimes even smaller passages in certain areas of the world in order to simply have the energy on which we have come to depend, that would be identified as a critical risk. And so what I would say is I am hopeful that this is something that can actually, not just for sustainability's sake, but as we've been talking about for resilience, really highlight the fragilities and the dependencies that we are very, very much on path dependence right now. So I put in a couple of reflections from my Forbes column that I hope are helpful, all in the same vein. But my core takeaway here is, if it's core to your value creation, it's something that is more likely to endure, which is why it's so important to have that both and mindset. But thanks for a great question.
Thanks so much. Narazia is not able to read, so I will just read theirs for them. So how do leaders balance competing priorities, financial sustainability versus environmental and social commitments? I know we've kind of covered that, but is there any other thoughts, maybe, Amir, that you want to add to that type of question?
How do they balance it? I think, as Mary also just mentioned, I think it's the thinking here is these shouldn't be two separate, essentially, goals to balance, because that's where traditionally the problem came from. If you're thinking about an objective function of a firm as maximizing, say, value, and then you have an objective function to decrease environmental harm or increase environmental benefit, having two different objectives, right? These should be essentially aligned, right? So the way that you are creating value is inherently connected to the way that you're reducing environmental harm or increasing environmental benefits. Now, that's, of course, not for all companies that's currently the case, right? But you can see how companies are changing business models to make that, to align those two goals. I think that's the way to think about this. But yeah, that's still a balancing act that many companies are still doing.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm conscious that we won't have time to hand over to our program team to speak about all of these programs at Oxford, but maybe I'll just maybe there's one question left for you, Amir, which is basically around attribution of positive results to sustainable actions. So if you have any thoughts there, maybe if you could put that in the chat, that would be really appreciated. But I'll hand back over to Neil to chat through our programs.
Hi, everyone. So thanks for joining us. We've got a few things coming up with our online programs at the moment. So these are fully online in April, May, and June, leading you up to the in-person program in September. And these touch on various topics, which I'm sure that my online team, Alex and Sahej, can drop into the chat their contact details if you want to find out more. But you can scan the QR codes and find out more about the program details and what modules are run and how long each program is run. So if you can move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about the in-person program. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the in-person Oxford Sustainable Business Program takes place in September. We are nearing getting full for this cohort. So if you do wish to apply, please either book a call to find out a little bit more, or you can scan that QR to find out more. That takes place over a 5-day period in Oxford, and you can join Mary and Alexis in person to really deep dive on these topics and hash out the frameworks of your strategy. We also have a few other things that I can share with you around being part of this community. So obviously, webinars like this happen quite regularly throughout the year. So Mary and Alexis and guest speakers like Amir send all of share their insights, their research, how to make the most of your leadership styles and what you're moving for sustainable practices. So if you do want to find out more, this webinar, along with any future ones, will be posted on our YouTube playlist, and I'll share the link for that shortly. But in relation to that, we also have the alumni perspective. So coming up in June, I'm sure that you'll receive an invite from me for our upcoming Alumni in Action from Insights to Implementation in Sustainable Business webinar. And this is where we take last year's alumni that have taken the in-person Sustainable Business program, and they talk about what they do in their organization, how things have followed on from taking the program, and they cover so many different topics around biodiversity accounting, environmental disclosures, science and modeling communities, as well as regulatory requirements. And then we also have things like blogs from their perspectives that share these details ongoing. So it's always a great opportunity to have these resources available if you are considering one of these programs. So the contact details for me and my team are available as well, but I will drop these details and links in the chat. So it was lovely to have you join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, it's been a fantastic conversation and a lot of information. And I do encourage you to reach out really to also dive into some of the existing work that we have online and some of the resources that we've shared in the chat. So fantastic. And thank you, Tanil. Thank you, Amir and Alexis, and to the whole team. And most of all, thank you to all of us for joining, or for all of you for joining. I really appreciate the also quality of the questions that we had across the group. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.